It's no longer news that former French colonies in Africa are continuously rising against parasitic French policies, oppression, exploitation, and neo-colonialism. The reasons for this growing recent French resentment across Africa are well known, and the young Africans have chosen to act accordingly. One of the new actors is Senegal's newly democratically elected 44-year-old pan-Africanist president, Bassirou Diomaye Faye, who was sworn into office early last week. Faye's rise to the presidency was a rough one. He went from tax inspector to political prisoner, then to the Senegalese presidency, where he has taken a sovereign stance and chosen to put the people of Senegal first. Before we continue, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the New Tourist channel to get all updates on Bassirou Diomaye Faye. Also, let us know in the comments that you want Senegal's new president to purge French oppression in his country. Acclaimed as Senegal's messiah, Faye has promised to lead Senegal to sovereignty and liberate the country from Western oppression and exploitation. Many West Africans have been looking at collaborations between Faye and other revolutionary leaders like Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, Assimi Goïta of Mali, and Abdelrahman Chiani of Niger. We have a video on our channel that shows that there's a possibility that Senegal could form a confederation with Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. One of Faye's promises was to purge the colonial currency used in West Africa, the CFA franc. This plan falls in line with the plans that Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali had in February when they mentioned that they are making plans to ditch the colonial CFA franc currency. Footage purporting to show President Faye has been widely shared across social media, with captions claiming he has told France to leave us alone. In the video, a man speaking in English says,
"It is high time for France to lift its knee off our neck and put an end to this unjust oppression. Centuries of misery, human trafficking, colonization, and neo-colonization have caused immeasurable suffering. It's time to put an end to this cycle of oppression. It's high time for France to leave us alone."
At no point in history has the CFA franc, the name of a colonial currency used in West and Central African countries belonging to the franc zone, been closer to its demise. Senegal's outgoing President Macky Sall was a pillar of the long-standing French attempt to remain influential among its former colonies, often named Francafrique. Now newly elected Faye, under the moniker of left pan-Africanism, has vowed to make his country more sovereign in food, energy, and finance. Never before have four West African governments, including one of the regional leaders, Senegal, been simultaneously eager and ready to get out of the neo-colonial stranglehold of the CFA franc. The CFA franc zone was founded by then-colonial power France after the Second World War. It aimed to ensure a continuously cheap influx of resources into France. It is well known that France stood firm against the coup-led government of Niger, because France was benefiting from exploiting uranium at cheap rates with the help of former President Bazoum. France acquired uranium from Niger at 400% below the price that Canada sells its own uranium. The CFA franc zone is divided into two. The West African CFA franc zone has 8 members: Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Senegal, Ivory Coast, Benin, Togo, and Guinea-Bissau. The Central African zone has 6: Cameroon, Gabon, Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, Chad, and Equatorial Guinea. Popular mobilization against the currency has been intense in recent years in West Africa. This led to cosmetic changes to the currency arrangements. For example, in 2019, French President Emmanuel Macron and the sitting president of Ivory Coast, Alassane Ouattara, announced the withdrawal of French staff from some of the regional central bank's decision-making bodies. They also waived the requirement, much maligned on the continent, to store 50% of all reserves in Paris as a guarantee to the former colonial power that they wouldn't be wasted on irresponsible fiscal expansion. This requirement was in the first place robbery in broad daylight. Overall, however, the CFA franc has remained more or less the same, and France has not been willing to leave the arrangement of its own accord. The old colonial attachment and supposed developmental benevolence has carried the day. But the conditions for major change are in place. The alliance of Sahel states between the junta-led governments of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger has stated its intention to introduce the Sahel as a new regional currency. Whether this initiative, and the Senegalese plan for a national currency will amount to a full breakup of the CFA franc zone, and its terminal decline will depend on how well they plan and execute the transition to several new currencies, or a new one without any French involvement. Many are now calling and hoping that Senegal's new president will team up with Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré and other Sahel leaders to have one currency. Historically, serious attempts at leaving the CFA franc since its inception in 1948 have been sabotaged by France. For example, Guinea was flooded by counterfeit banknotes when it left the CFA franc in the 1960s. Mali was put under pressure to rejoin the CFA franc after its departure in 1967. It returned to the fold in 1984. In 2011, Ivorian President Laurent Gbagbo, who had been considering pulling out of the CFA franc, was made to step down after controversial elections with the help of a military intervention force. He was then sent to the International Criminal Court before being acquitted 10 years later. France went further in 2011, a case countries wanting to make the next attempt at leaving the CFA franc should be cognizant of. It used its seat on the Central Bank of West African states' decision-making bodies to block Ivory Coast from being refinanced by the bank. It also induced the subsidiaries of BNP Paribas and Société Générale to temporarily close their branches. Leaving the CFA franc has thus historically come with a high risk of French sabotage. But the constellation of forces has shifted, and West African governments can better prepare this time. If they join forces and Ivory Coast votes for a less France-dependent president in the presidential elections in 2025, like Senegal has done, then the end of the West African CFA franc may indeed be near. Now, let us go back to Senegal's messiah, President Bassirou Diomaye Faye. Before we do, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the New Tourist channel, and share the video with all your family and friends. President Faye's election program had a roadmap towards leaving the CFA franc and setting up a national currency. Among the key steps are creating a national central bank, refinancing state expenditure at 0%, demonetizing gold, and preventing its import and export to build up a gold reserve, repatriating gold reserves still stored in Paris and all over the world, reprofiling public debt and canceling private debt through monetary fiat, installing a deposit insurance scheme for small savers, building a national stock exchange. Finally, the new currency will be floating and non-convertible or semi-convertible to shield it from speculative attacks. This menu is similar to some of the strategies China has employed over the last decades to maintain government control over the economy and shield the Chinese economic growth path from foreign, in other words, speculative interference. The success of such a strategy depends to a large degree on mobilizing domestic financial and real domestic resources. The strategic challenge for Faye will thus be to enlist a sufficiently large group of small business people, landowners, power brokers, and the capitalist class in Senegal to his economically transformative project. Well, it appears Senegal's messiah is ready to go to any length to purge French exploitation. This will be a sizable challenge in the face of upcoming export revenues from gas and oil, contracts Mr. Faye has vowed to renegotiate, and an overall economic structure that is not yet domestic market-oriented. For example, the Sangomar oil project off the coast of Senegal that is 82% owned by Australian company Woodside Energy, while Senegal only has 18%, will most probably be renegotiated under Faye's regime. A national currency could support this shift in focus towards the well-being of the Senegalese people. This is because its logic would be to reorient the government towards the domestic economy and its people. Imports and easy repatriation of earnings by foreign corporations, which are some of the main effects of the often overvalued CFA franc, would become more difficult. Overall, Senegal and the Sahel governments are in a stronger position globally than ever before. The African continent is seen as essential to ensure the energy transition in Europe, as well as its diversification of oil and gas supply. Western military, diplomatic, and trade hegemony on the continent is being challenged by China and Russia, as well as Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Turkey. If Senegal and the Sahel governments position the end of the CFA franc well in their overall negotiations with their international partners, as well as their domestic capitalist class and opposing political forces, its end may indeed be near. That will not be the end of the long road towards food, energy, and overall economic sovereignty to the benefit of the people, but it will be an important symbolic and material victory against post-colonial interference and meddling. The colonial CFA franc has outlived its usefulness for today's left pan-Africanism. Organizing its end is a sizable challenge, but for the first time in decades is one that can be confronted head-on. Indeed, Africans have had enough. What will Senegal's new president do? What do you think of Senegal's new president? Let us know in the comments if you want African countries to drop the colonialist currency. Also, do not forget to subscribe to the New Tourist channel for more updates on Africa.